Right, good evening, Brennan. First of all, I'd like to thank Ringers Master Bob and Brother Brian and the brethren of number 12 for inviting me along to do this presentation tonight. It's a wee bit of the foreground to the actual presentation as to how I first became interested in this guy, John Witherspoon. It first started a few years ago when visiting my older sister, and past brother-in-law who live in New Jersey in a township called Manalapan, which is just about an hour outside southeast of New York City. They were both, or Sarah still is, members of this church, Old Tennant Church, which is a Presbyterian church. In fact, my sister Sarah is a deacon in this church. But on holiday when we were there one Sunday after the morning service, I got in conversation with their minister, Reverend Douglas Hughes, Presbyterian minister of this church, who had recently taken over charge of the church and was very interested in the church's history, as I was. So in the conversation, he mentioned John Witherspoon, and was a wee bit kind of taken aback when I said area. He was a Presbyterian minister. He came from Scotland, and he was the only clergyman to sign the American Declaration of Independence. But I'm surprised because he came from Beath in Scotland, where your sister Sarah and you were born. So as usual, my flippant self, a wee bit of humour, I said to him, well, Sarah was born in Beath, but I was born in Kilburnie. My father had a bike, but that kind of went over the top of his head. But anyway, as it probably has tonight. But I went to secondary school in Beath in teenage years, and in later years palled about Beath with friends, and at drinking age I've visited most of the hostelries in Beath in Ayrshire, and I'd never come across the name John Witherspoon. So when I came home, I thought I'll have a wee ask about this guy if anybody knows of him. And certainly round about Beath, Kilburnie, they seemed to know of him. He said, he came from Beath, he was a minister, he went to America and he signed the American Declaration of Independence. And round about this area, when I asked locals here, at a pub talk, they said, he came from Paisley. He was a minister or something, and he went to America and he signed the Declaration of Independence. I think there's a statue to him somewhere in Paisley. So that whetted my appetite about finding out a wee bit more of John Witherspoon. So here we go. John Witherspoon. He was actually born in Gifford, a small village in Midlothian, on the 5th of February 1723. His father was the Reverend James Alexander Witherspoon. He was a minister in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland in the old parish church of Yester, which is in Gifford. It is now a national monument. You can visit it. Apparently it's worth quite a visit. But anyway, that's where John Witherspoon started off. His father, the Reverend James, was a staunch Protestant and nationalist. And the family, through John Witherspoon's mother, Anne Walker, claimed descendant from John Knox, that famous preacher. Although there's no primary documentation to substantiate that or disprove it. But as John Knox was born in Gifford, there may be some credibility to the family's claims. And that's just a wee picture of where Gifford is. Can you get my cursor to work? But it's down here. As you see, it's just below Haddington there to the east of Edinburgh. John Witherspoon's academic career started at an early age, where he was fortunate enough to attend Haddington Grammar School. Now, if you remember, this was 1720s. Formal education didn't exist. So you were either from a very wealthy family or a very privileged family to be able to take advantage of education at a school. Because remember, Robbie Burns wouldn't be born for another 30 years. And as we know, Burns' father paid, along with some of his friends, for Burns and some of his pals to be privately tutored. So John Witherspoon was in quite a privileged position to be able to go to grammar school at a young age. But he must have been quite a good academic, because after grammar school, he went on to Edinburgh University, where he obtained a Master of Arts degree. That was in 1739, when he was 16 years of age. Now, I don't know if a 16-year-old today would be able to achieve a Master of Arts degree. Maybe some of the academics amongst you might know better than I do, but I think it's quite an achievement. But not only did he receive his MA degree, he remained at university to study divinity and was ordained as a minister in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland in September 1743. And like his father, he was a staunch Protestant nationalist and supporter of republicanism. Now, this wee bit of time from 1743, the next main event I picked him up on was when he continued his pastoral career in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And in 1745, he was given his first church, or charge of his first church, which was in fact in Beith in Ayrshire. So here we have the Beith connection. He did the comfy Beith, but his first church was in Beith in Ayrshire. At the same time, he got married. He married one Elizabeth Montgomery, who came from Craighouse down in Ayrshire. So there he is, settling in to married life and his first pastoral charge in the Low Kirk in Beith down in Ayrshire. Because of his staunch beliefs, his staunch Protestant and Republicanism beliefs, he was opposed to the Catholic Jacobite rising of 45 to 46. So this was a train crash that came along to John Witherspoon just after he'd taken charge of his first church and got married. Along comes the Jacobite rising. But because of his beliefs being very staunch, he got together a body of volunteers from Beith. And the story goes that he took them up to Glasgow, where they had a few skirmishes with Bonnie Prince Charlie's army. The story is that he was advised to go back to Beith, but he disregarded that and went on with his comrades or his volunteers. And next we find him in 1746, commanding a body of volunteers on the front line of the government forces facing Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobite army at the Battle of Falkirk. Now, as the historians amongst you will know, that was one battle that the Jacobites won. And unfortunately for John Witherspoon and his comrades, they were captured by the Jacobites and subsequently imprisoned in Doon Castle in Perthshire. Now the story takes a few bits of turns and maybe a wee bit of license to it. One story is that John Witherspoon and his fellow captors escaped from the castle by knotting bed sheets together, and as in the Glasgow term, dreeping out an upstairs window and got on their toes and made their escape. The other story is that as the Jacobite rebellion collapsed in 1746, they were released from the castle. But I prefer to go with the first theory, that they managed to escape from the Jacobites. But whatever happened, on his escape or release, he returned to Beith to pick up the threads of his married life and his pastoral duties in the parish of Beith. He was to stay as minister in Beith for 13 years, which is quite a long time. There is a theory that he suffered ill health for the rest of his life due to the treatment that he received at Castle, but I can't find anything later on in history of him that refers to this, so it may be fact, it may not be. The picture on the right is actually the old square in Beith as it is today, and that building that you can see is the old church that John Witherspoon preached in, the Lake Kirk. That's the square at Beith. Down in the left-hand corner is where the lodge in Beith is. The front door of that lodge basically looks out onto that square. And for years and years I knew that building was there in the old churchyard, but I had no knowledge of it being connected to or any knowledge of John Witherspoon. There's a tangible film. That was the church that he preached in for nearly 13 years. So he must have been doing all right as a minister, because in 1758 he got a bit of promotion and he was moved to the Lake Kirk in Paisley, or the Low Kirk as it was called. So here we have the Paisley connection. He was to be in Paisley for another 10 years. So if you add them together, 13 years in Beith and 10 years in Paisley, 23 years as a minister. Involved in that, he was involved in the Jacobite rebellion, had been a prisoner of war, so to speak, suffered ill health. But on top of that, during his two pastorates in both churches, he wrote 3 well-known works in theology, one being a satire opposing the philosophical influence of one Francis Hutcheson. And John Witherspoon was also a well-known and fierce and eloquent debater at the General Assembly of Scotland. So here we see a picture of a man who isn't a timid wee minister going about his parish, looking after his parishioners. We see a man that is staunch in his beliefs, not afraid to let everyone know what his beliefs were, and was not afraid to take on the establishment. Francis Hutcheson was an Irish minister from Ulster, who at that time was in charge of Glasgow University. So Witherspoon wasn't afraid to take on the establishment, as well as letting the common people know of his beliefs. So we see a bit of picture of the man. So maybe he was in some way descended from John Knox, was that type of character. So here the story gets, for me anyway, started to get really quite interesting. That's enough for any man in a life, I would think, but not for John Witherspoon. It goes on. Also, he was awarded a doctorate in divinity from St Andrews in 1764. So he was well known and well respected within his own circles. But while in Paisley, he became acquainted with 2 Americans, one being Benjamin Rush and the other one being a guy called Richard Stockton. Now, I use the term Americans because America didn't exist at that time. It was still a colony of the British Empire. So that kind of triggered a wee bit in me. I thought, how did he manage to meet these 2 guys? What were they doing kicking about Paisley in the 1700s? And my imagination started to go a wee bit. I was thinking, what was there to do in Paisley in the 1700s? What were the pubs like, the inns or the taverns? You know, it's probably no much different from what they are today. But anyway, my mind kind of wandered a wee bit. So then I thought, who were these 2 guys and why were they here in Scotland in the 1700s? So the first guy is Benjamin Rush. He was born in 1745 in Virginia, I think it was. When his father died, his aunt and uncle took him on and furthered his education. And amongst going to other schools, he went to a college in New Jersey, where at 14 years old, he obtained a BA degree. So he beat Witherspoon by 2 years in getting his BA degree. He wanted to be a doctor, and his uncle furthered his medical career or his medical education in America. But along with Benjamin Rush's tutor, medical tutor, they financed him for his travel across here to Scotland to study medicine at the University of Edinburgh, which apparently at that time was the place, the 1700s, to study medicine, where he obtained his MD degree in 1768. Now, while he was in Edinburgh, he was a bit of a celebrity. He was wined and dined by the nobility and the well-to-do, but he was taken under the arm of one David Leslie, who was the 6th Earl of Leven at the time. And more especially, he was very friendly with the Earl of Leven's son, William Leslie. If you can remember that name, William Leslie, because it crops up later on in the presentation. Maybe in the question and answer session. So Benjamin Rush was a bit of a well-known character about Edinburgh. The second person, Richard Stockton, a different kettle of fish. He was born 1730, again in America. But he's the son of quite a wealthy family and studied law. Graduated a law degree in 1748. He was at 18 years old. He was admitted to the bar in America in 1754. And in 1763, he received the highest degree of law in America. So he's a bit of a shrewd cookie, this guy, Richard Stockton. Wealthy, well-to-do in America at that time with several law practices. But he decided to give them up and travel over to have a look at England, Scotland and Ireland. Because remember, America at that time was still a British colony. When he arrived in London, he was a bit of a celebrity. He was wined and dined by the royalty in London. He apparently was a bit of a dashing character, tall, handsome, obviously wealthy. He was apparently a excellent swordsman and a very accomplished horseman. He was also kind of well versed in what was going on across the water, and the royalty and the government at the time took his advice and quizzed him in what actually was going on. Because remember that at that time we had the rumblings of the revolution starting in America. And as such, he presented an address to King George III acknowledging the repeal of the Stamp Act, which was a horrible tax that the British government imposed on the colonists to add on to hundreds of other taxes that they put on them. Which I don't want to go into. That's all part of the American War of Independence. But they very quickly realised that the Stamp Act was the straw that was going to break the camel's back, and they repealed it after a year. But Stockton gave an address to King George III acknowledging the repeal of this Stamp Act. So he was quite an intelligent, knowledgeable and well-known character. So what were they doing kicking about Edinburgh and Paisley, and especially what interest did they have in John Witherspoon? Well, the reason was that both Rush and Stockton belonged to or were trustees of this college in New Jersey, in Princeton in New Jersey. And in John Witherspoon, they saw the man who they were looking for to turn round the fortunes of the college, which at that time was in a bit of a pickle, both financially, structurally and academically. And in John Witherspoon, they saw the man that they thought would be able to turn round the fortunes of the college. So in 1766, it's written that Witherspoon officially rejected or knocked back their offer to travel to America, mostly due to his wife protesting that she didn't want to go. John Witherspoon and his wife Elizabeth, during their marriage, had 10 children between them. Only 5 survived into adulthood. So he had quite a big family life apart from his ministerial duties. And remember, he'd been a minister for 23 years, been in the war, written some books, was well known, eloquent debater. To give all that up and go to the new world, so to speak, would have been a bit of a wrench. But 1766, he rejected their offer, but in 1768, he changed his mind and agreed to go. So 1768, they upped sticks and emigrated to New Jersey, where he became the president and head professor at this College of New Jersey in Princetown. That was when he was age 45. And at that age, he became the 6th president of the college. Now, you'll probably be ahead of me. You know that this College of New Jersey is now what's known as Princeton University, one of the premier universities in the States. So John Witherspoon, although he wasn't a founding member of Princeton University, he was certainly the man that built it up to what it is today, or helped to build it up to what it is today. When he arrived there, he found the college to be heavily in debt. So he set about raising funds, and he raised them both locally in America and in Scotland. It's also said that he gifted 300 of his own books and papers to the college library. Now, just a wee recap, but you had in Paisley, the Low Kirk in Paisley, part of the building is still there. It's at the bottom of New Street in Paisley, if any of you know Paisley or know New Street. New Street runs from the top of the High Street down to Causey Side Street. And at the top corner of it, there's I think it used to be a YMCA building hostel or a Salvation Army hostel. But just a wee bit further down on the left-hand side, there's a Bull Inn, which is reputed to be the oldest pub in Paisley. But if you go right down to the bottom of New Street, on the left-hand side, you'll see this building, Paisley Arts Centre, where pre-COVID they held plays and functions and cabarets and had some bands and music, etc. Part of that building is the old kirk that John Witherspoon preached in, and the graveyard round about it as well. So there's tangible evidence, both in Beith and in Paisley, of John Witherspoon. So it was quite nice to be able to, just pre-COVID, I had a wee wander around it, but I didn't do enough. I didn't have enough time to look into it, but I just felt there was a wee touch with John Witherspoon, that he would have walked about there. But that's where it is anyway. Part of the building is still there at the bottom of New Street on the left-hand side. That's what he moved to in Princeton. The one on the left was the president's quarters, a bit of a difference in Princeton. And the one on the right is just a picture of Princeton University as it basically is today. Quite a difference from being in Paisley. But again, world events sort of turned against John Witherspoon, and along came the American War of Independence. While I was at the college, he instituted a number of reforms at the college, including the syllabus and university structure as the ones used by Edinburgh and Glasgow universities. He also firmed up the entrance requirements to compete with Harvard and Yale colleges at the time. So he's working hard at building up this college. And then along came the American War of Independence. Witherspoon slowly became uneasy with the British Crown's interference in the local and colonial affairs, including those of the church, which had previously been the prerogatives and rights of the American authorities. Now, although the colonies in America were under the British Crown, they allowed the Americans at that time, they allowed the colonists to set up their own, probably devolved government, if you want to call it that way, and run affairs themselves. But as at that time, the British Crown were heavily in debt after their wars against the French, etc. They're trying to recoup money, especially George III. So they're imposing tax after tax on the colonists and also plundering all the goods. Because as we know, especially a lot of the cotton, tobacco, tea, etc., sugar, came from the new colonies, and the colonists themselves are getting paid washers for it, whereas the tobacco barons in Glasgow, Liverpool, London were making a fortune, both through the products and through the slave trade, as we know. So Witherspoon was getting a bit uneasy with all this, especially when the government started interfering with the church in the new colonies. It hit a nerve with John Witherspoon. He saw similar events. He saw these events in the same lens as had befallen the Covenanters in the 1600s. His Covenanter ancestors, a lot of them fled Scotland and emigrated. A lot of them settled round about New Jersey. So he was a bit of a sympathiser with them, and he saw the way things were going the same way. He didn't like it. So in 1774, he aligned his support to the revolution. George Washington at the time appointed him congressional chaplain of it was actually called the Continental Army, but you could say the American Army. And in 1776, John Witherspoon voted to adopt the Virginia Resolution for Independence. And in June 1776, he put his signature to the Declaration of Independence. He was the only active clergyman to do so. Now here we see a picture of the famous picture, you've probably all seen it, Declaration of Independence. This picture is famous in America. In fact, I think there's same pictures depicted on the $2 bill, the back of the $2 bill. But in actual fact, it's in the same vein as the picture of Robert Burns being initiated at Canongate, Kilwinning. This event didn't happen as it's been portrayed. The artist, this was painted maybe 40 odd years after the event. What it actually shows is the proposal of the draft of the Declaration of Independence being put to the representatives of the various states in America at the time. But more interesting, I can't get my I've seen various versions of this painting. It's supposedly depicting the 51 guys who signed the Declaration of Independence. It didn't happen like that. These men were never in the same room at the same time. But what it does depict is the proposal of the Declaration, the draft copy of it. But along with most of these paintings that you can get, there's a key comes numbered that numbers each character. And I've seen 2 or 3 copies and the key's different. It names different people. Because apparently the artist, when he didn't have a portrait, remember there's no photographs in those times, when he didn't have an actual portrait of a person or know the person in real life, he made it up what the character looked like. Maybe had a look at the guy's son or brother or something like that and portrayed it. But the ones in this picture that are more interesting, I can't get my cursor to work, but if you look at the table, there's a sheaf of papers more or less on the middle of the table. You can see a guy's elbow, left arm, his elbow pointing. There's 3 men sitting down, 2 with black shirts or coats on, and the other one with a slightly bronzy coat on or whatever you get. The guy in the middle is John Witherspoon, and the 2 sitting next to him is Benjamin Rush and Richard Stockton. Now that is common through the various representations or various issues of this picture that I've seen. So there he is sitting in the middle there. That's John Witherspoon, who did sign the Declaration of Independence, and so did Benjamin Rush and Richard Stockton. The other difference is that the flags in the background on the wall, this particular version shows 1, 2, 3, 4 British ensign flags. These apparently are taken out a lot of the other prints of this picture. But the main one that hangs in Washington, I think, is that one that shows the British ensigns in the background. Here we have the Declaration of Independence. I don't know how well you can see it. If it's on a big screen, you might be able to just make out some of the signatures. I tried to blow it up, but it didn't work. And I can't point out any of the cursor does work. Oh, there we go, it does work after all. There's Benjamin Rush's signature there, if you can see that one. Richard Stockton's signature is here, and John Witherspoon's is here, amongst the other famous signatories that you know of, John Hammond and various other ones, George Washington, etc., etc. Apparently, it took quite a few months for this document to be signed, so it wasn't signed at the one time in the one room. But nevertheless, they are there, and he did sign the Declaration of Independence. In November 1977, as the war was going on, the British advanced through Princetown. George Witherspoon evacuated the college and his family to safety. The British ransacked the college, which was badly damaged, and all his papers and personal notes were lost in the carnage. Being chaplain of the Continental Army, as they call it, he was relatively unscathed throughout the war, but he did have a personal loss, because also in 1977, his eldest son, Major James Witherspoon, was killed at the Battle of Germantown. He lost his life there. After the war, Witherspoon was responsible for the reconstruction of the college, which caused him great personal difficulty and great personal expense. But he stuck on with it and helped to build the college up and its reputation as a college of excellence. He also worked in Congress till 1784, and it said he served in over 10,000 committees. So, as well as working away at the college and doing things, he helped to shape America as we know it, the Constitution, etc. He had a hand in drafting that, all these other documents that they have in America. So he was very active up until 1784. Once he became of an age, I suppose, he bought a ranch or a farm outside Princeton called Tusculum, and that's where he retired to. Apparently he went blind round about 1779, but he continued on as well as he could in Congress. There must have been some achievement. Unfortunately, his wife Elizabeth died in 1789, aged 67, which is a really old age, a long age for that time, 1700s. I don't know what the average lifespan would be in that time. It's reckoned to be around 30s, late 30s, maybe 40. So considering what they went through, they lived to a ripe old age. And my wife Ina, when she had a wee look at this, she asked, is there any mention of his wife in all this? I said, well, not really, not that I've found. And her comment was, she must have been one hell of a woman. And the words of Dolly Parton, stand by your man, to stick with her husband through all what he went through and what she must have gone through as well, trying to bring up a family. She bore him 10 children, obviously. And as I said, she must have been some woman. And sadly, she passed away 1789, age 67. So imagine John Witherspoon was a bit distraught about all this, but then I began to wonder, because 18 months later, he married a 23-year-old widow, and he had 2 more children by her. So he couldn't have been that distraught. It was all John Witherspoon, I liked his home comforts. He died in 1794, aged 71. He's buried in President's Row in Princeton Cemetery. The other fact that came out that after his death, his will and a list of his belongings, which apparently was a common thing to do in those days, all his possessions and his estate, showed that he owned slaves. He owned 2 slaves. And during his time debating while in America, he actively lectured against the abolition of slavery. So we're seeing a slightly different side to this man. As I say, an inventory of his possessions taken at his death included 2 slaves valued at $100 each, which today is about £2,000 in today's money. So we'll leave that to the question and answering session. You see a totally different side to John Witherspoon. That's one of the pictures I could find of him. Doesn't look very exceptional for the time. Can't really tell the picture. I don't even know if it is a true representation of him. And there is a statue of him in Paisley. It's outside the university in Paisley. And I wondered if that statue had been relocated from somewhere else in Paisley. I've been reliably informed that it was in fact commissioned specifically for the university. So there he is outside the university in Paisley. It suffered a bit of damage a few months ago through the Black Lives Matter type of thing, when it was made more commonly known that he was actually a slave owner. But I believe the statue is still there, unscathed at the moment. So that's John Witherspoon. But to go back to the beginning, a wee bit about Old Tennant's Church, which maybe opens up a wee bit of dialogue afterwards. That's my sister Sarah there with the sunglasses on. That church was built in 1732, Presbyterian church. The original church was 5 miles down the road. It was built by the Covenanters in around about 1692. But because of land disputes, they had to move. And they moved up the road here and built that church. The church is the original building. Inside's original. It's a fascinating building, even to go in and walk around. All the fittings inside are original, just like an old Church of Scotland. No statues, wooden pews, very sparse inside. But part of its history is that during the American War of Independence, there was a battle fought in the field next door to the church between the Continental Army and the British forces, who were making their way back south. George Washington and Benjamin Rush requisitioned that church as a field hospital, where they treated the wounded and fallen from the battle. The actual Battle of Monmouth is a national monument now. You can go and visit it in the big visitor centre, etc., etc. But that's worth a presentation on its own. But suffice to say, that building was used as a field hospital by Benjamin Rush and George Washington. And there's still marks inside that the minister assured me that quite a while ago they had them analysed, and they were in fact what was left of blood. So it definitely was used as a hospital. Also, a lot of the fallen from the battle are buried in the graveyard. That's a picture of two tombstones. So the one on the left is the fallen from the Continental Army, or the Americans, who are buried in a communal grave. And the thing that struck me about it is, if you can see it, or if you can read it, the number of Scots names and English names that are on that monument. And I beg the question of the minister, why were these guys fighting on the American side, so to speak? And he said, well, most of them would have been either first or second generation colonists that were fed up with the British interference, but a lot of them, if not the majority of them, were indentured servants, which again I'll leave to the question and answer session. They weren't much better than slaves, and so very disillusioned with the British government and seek to better themselves, so to speak, by fighting on the side of the Americans. The one on the right is probably more of an interest to you, brethren. It's two officers, one from each side, they're buried together, side by side. One on the left is a very English name, Fauntleroy, but he was fighting for the Continental Army. The one on he was a lowly captain. The one on the right was a lieutenant colonel. They were both killed on the same day at the Battle of Monmouth. They're buried side by side. And I asked the only two there that are like that, and I asked the minister if he knew why. And he said, well, as far as he knew, when the old records, they were both Masons. They're both Freemasons. And he alluded to the monument on the left, which is very common, as we know, to the smooth and the rough ashlar. But whether it's fact or not, pretty sure there's that is a reason for them being buried there together. Just to finish off, brethren, you'll be glad to know, this is my late brother-in-law, Jimmy Shaw, who passed away in 2014. You'd have been really interested in this presentation. He was a member of Lodge Copestone in Kearney, New Jersey. But unfortunately, due to ill health in later years, he couldn't attend the meetings as often as he would want to do. But his wish was that his ashes be buried in the graveyard at Old Tenants Church, and that's his stone, as you can see. He was a very proud Mason. He was born in Scotland, but he naturalised to America, but a very proud man. And with your permission, I'd like to dedicate this presentation to the memory of Brother Jimmy Shaw. Thank you, brother. Over to you, Bob.
Fantastic, Ronnie. Thanks very much for that. So, yeah, everybody's clapping away there. Good. Can't hear you yet.
It's difficult when you're just talking to a screen. You don't know what the reaction is, you know. I hope, if any of you knew of John Witherspoon, I hope you've got some interesting facts out of it. And those of you that had never heard of him, I hope you found it as interesting as I did. There's a lot of threads in this with the characters, which I'll be quite happy to try, if you have any questions or queries, which I'll be quite happy to try and answer. When I was doing the research, it was difficult not to go away on a tangent with some of these characters. You could actually do a presentation, and some of them especially, I don't know why they've never made a film of them, because it's absolutely fascinating. But I'm going to charge my glass, have a look, and I'll be more than willing to try and answer any questions or queries that you might have.
Okay. Well,
thank you.
Thanks once again, Ronnie. Can I start off? And there was no indication that John Witherspoon himself was a Freemason or associated with them in any way.
I think we're going to go down this road. Could I charge my glass and then we'll maybe talk? I imagine some of the other guys might want to have a look or charge their glass. 2 seconds.
Okay, right, okay. If you're needing your glass refilled or whatever.
We can hold our bladders.
Not the only thing you can hold. These headphones are great. You can walk a bit and still talk.
Hope you're not in the toilet with them on.
No, not at all. No, I'm okay. It was just if anybody wanted a comfort break, you know, that was all. No, I'm fine.
Good.
Just something. Well, John's doing that. The Oscar winner, Reese Witherspoon, is actually a descendant of this family.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot. To be make your mind up about John Witherspoon. Obviously, I knew there would be a Masonic connection, and I tried to shy away from that.
Sorry.
No, not at all. No, it just depends on where the questions. And answering it, I might answer some other questions or some other wee queries. Masonically, as far as the Declaration of Independence goes, I have a list of all the signatories of that declaration, which lists them as being Freemasons or otherwise. And it's quite interesting because apparently, documentation-wise, there's only 16%, or that works out about 9 or 10 of them, are definitely known to be active Freemasons. But what we have on the list is, well, we have ones that say not a Mason, definitely not a Mason, but other ones say no documentation of Masonic membership, no evidence that he was a Mason. From 1765 till early 1800s, in the Princetown area, New Jersey, there are no Masonic records. Although there was Masonic lodges, the British destroyed all the records. So this also happened elsewhere as the British forces advanced and retreated. Both sides operated a kind of scorched earth type of policy, where they destroyed everything they could so that the enemy couldn't utilise it or use it. But that included burning documents and papers, etc., books, that sort of thing. So in the year 17, I've got it written down here, I can't remember. From 1765 to 1813, there have been no records in the Princetown, New Jersey area, Masonic records found. Maybe they have now, I don't know. But to answer your question, the three main characters who come out of this are Witherspoon, Benjamin Rush, and Richard Stockton. Benjamin Rush, although he's down as no documentation of being a Freemason, remember I spoke about when he was in Edinburgh, he was very friendly with the Earl of Leven and Earl of Leven's son, William Leslie. If you just bear with me a second, get this right, because I know Alan Beck will pull me up on it if it's not. When Benjamin Rush was trying to talk John Witherspoon into going to America, he was studying medicine in Edinburgh. He was very friendly with David Leslie, the 6th Earl of Leven. David Leslie, 6th Earl of Leven, was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Scotland from 1759 to 1761. He also held offices in the police force, etc. So he was an active Freemason. Benjamin Rush must have known that. His son, William Leslie, was also a Freemason. He was a member of Athol, number treble 1 in 1763. So Benjamin Rush's best pal, William Leslie, was a Freemason. Richard Stockton was a Freemason. He was what's named as a charter master of a lodge in Princeton, which I get the name of it. I've got it here somewhere. St John's Lodge in Princeton, 1765. He was the first charter master when the lodge was initiated, which I take it to be our equivalent of the Right Worshipful Master. I may be wrong. So when he was in Paisley in Edinburgh, cajoling John Witherspoon to go to America, he would either be a master or past master of that lodge. So they were moving in Masonic circles. But whether John Witherspoon was a a Freemason or not, there's no documentation to either prove or disprove it, as far as I can find anyway. But it gets a wee bit more interesting, if you would bear with me. Remember I said to remember William Leslie, being a great pal of Benjamin Rush when he was in Edinburgh. During the War of Independence, while Benjamin Rush was tending to the wounded of both sides after a battle, he found out from a captured British soldier, or one account says a captured British officer, that he had been captured while driving a wagon with dead and wounded on it, which was the policy at the time. They didn't want to leave any of their dead on the battlefield because of desecration and looting. So he'd been driving this wagon loaded with dead and some wounded, and he informed Benjamin Rush through talk that one of the dead was in fact William Leslie, who joined the British forces and had been sent out in the relief force to the new colonies, who had been killed in the battle. I can't remember the battle that he was killed in. The Battle of Princeton, actually, when the British were heading south again. So Benjamin Rush went and found his pal's body, which was on something like the 3rd of January. But on the 5th of January, George Washington heard the story and discovered it, and he ordered that William Leslie be buried with full military honours. Now, for somebody like that to be buried, he was quite a lowly officer in the British Army, but to be buried with full military honours seems a bit strange. But remember, George Washington was a Freemason. William Leslie was a Freemason. He was also the son of the Earl of Leven, who was the Grand Master of Scotland. So there's definitely a Masonic connection there somewhere. You know? And that is documented that that did happen with Benjamin Rush. Richard Stockton, I think they could make a film about this guy. He was he was a lawyer, very intelligent man. In the early days, he seemed to be very pro-British, the colonists. He had his finger in politics as well as law. That was why he was cajoled, etc., when he was in London by King George. When the hostilities were starting or going round about, he was captured by American sympathisers who were pro-British, who were basically pro-British. He was caught giving information to some of the colonists about British troop movements. They handed him over to the British, who tried him and imprisoned him. The British used old Navy ships, wooden ships, anchored them in Hudson Bay. I think it's Hudson Bay, New York, and used them as prison ships. And they reckon more died on these ships than were actually killed in the battles. But Richard Stockton found himself in one of these ships. The story then goes that the British offered certain people a pardon if they signed the document and promised not to get involved in the hostilities. And for some reason, Richard Stockton was released and carried on. So during the war and just after the war, he was viewed. There was a lot of argument about him actually signing the Declaration of Independence. But eventually, they recanted and let him put his signature to it. But he was regarded with suspicion for a long, long time, being a bit of a chameleon, jumping from one side to the other. He carried on in politics after the war, but I think he's a bit of a character. I think you could make a good film of him, a bit of a Scarlet Pimpernel, But he was definitely. He said that he never signed anything to be released. That was his argument. I did not sign any document to say he was released. So they might have put the document to him, but he didn't sign it. So there's a bit of a question mark about him. He died at quite an early age through cancer, I think it was. But I find him fascinating. The fact that they were all walking about Paisley in the 1700s. I don't know how you guys view it, but I think it's quite a fascinating story. As I say, I wonder what Paisley was like in those days, you know. As I say,
Probably a bit safer than it is now.
not much different for today. But yeah, I mean, even just the basics of how you couldn't just up sticks and go to Glasgow Airport, jump in a plane and go to America, you know. How did they do it? That's what intrigues me, the actual mechanics of how they managed to do all these things and still survive and come back for more. But as far as John Witherspoon goes, I'd never heard of him. I don't know how many of the rest of you had a news story. I knew the full story. One thing, if we can talk about the slavery thing, John Witherspoon knew about slavery when he was in Beith. There's a guy called Shepherd in Beith, a landowner, who brought an African slave from Virginia to Beith to be trained as an apprentice cabinet maker. Beith, if you don't know, Beith was famous for its quality furniture at one time. Lots of quality furniture works in Beith, real quality craftsmanship stuff. So this guy Shepherd, in the 1750s, brought this African slave from America to train as a cabinet maker in Beith. And his view was that he would get him trained as a cabinet maker and then take him back to America and sell him for a profit. But John Witherspoon welcomed this African slave into his church in Beith. He actually baptised him, gave him the name John Montgomery, or some say James Montgomery. But he baptised him. But in doing that, he told him he was not making him a free man. He was only making him free from the sins of God. That he wouldn't be emancipated. It was out with John Witherspoon's powers to do that. The story takes a wee turn because one story is that John Montgomery or James Montgomery got on his toes after he'd been baptised and headed back to America. And when on getting there, he propounded that he was a free man because he'd been baptised in the Church of Scotland. The other story is that Shepherd, the guy that had brought him to Beith, was so enraged with Witherspoon that he had the slave bound and transported to Port Glasgow, where he was going to put him on a ship back to Virginia. But either during the trip or whatever, the guy escaped. He managed to escape to Edinburgh, where he got captured. And he was put in prison in Edinburgh, awaiting a ruling by the judges as to what was to happen to him. But unfortunately, he died in the prison. So which part of the story is true, I don't know. But I haven't done enough research into it. But the fact is that John Witherspoon knew about slavery in the 1750s and went to America knowing about slavery. And the fact that he also spoke against the abolition of slavery. He was very anti the abolition of slavery, whereas Benjamin Rush was very pro the abolition of slavery. Benjamin Rush argued against it. But also Benjamin Rush actively encouraged Negro and coloured students to the College of New Jersey, where he personally tutored them with a view to them becoming missionaries and going back to Africa. And it seems he had 2 slaves on his ranch or his farm in Liscallum. But we know George Washington was a slave owner. In fact, I've got a list here of all the signatories of the Declaration as to whether they were slave owners or not. The majority of them were slave owners. But I can't get my head around it. I can't look at it through their eyes, you know. And I don't think any of us can either. It just seemed to be the accepted thing at the time. How did they treat these people? I don't know. We know And I wonder what Robbie Burns, when he thought about going to Jamaica, did he know about slavery? Did he know what it was like? Or how would he have reacted once he got there? That's part of John Witherspoon that I can't quite get my head around. The story is that he bought them, but to run the ranch for him, you know. And maybe there was a view that he thought that some of his papers that the slaves weren't ready for emancipation because they were uneducated. They couldn't fend for themselves. The brutality bit maybe got taken away, but the exploitation didn't. So I don't know. It just shows a side of the man that I was surprised when I got to the end of it and I found out that he actually owned 2 slaves. He wasn't a slave trader or anything like that, but he was a slave owner, as the majority of them seem to have been.
Okay, thanks, Ronnie. We'll go.
Hey, Watchful Master.
Yes.
It's Joe speaking. I wonder if
Thank
I would be fascinated to explore some of these ideas we're on. And I really thought it was a great talk, I should say. I've really enjoyed it. I didn't know about this man, but it's not surprising to me, as probably most of you know, 40% of the signatories to the Declaration of Arbroath claim to be Scottish. But I wonder if I could just make a few observations to see if it would get the conversation going. First of all, it was not unusual in this period in the 18th century in Scotland for there to be slaves here. If you go to some of the aristocratic mausoleums, you'll find that the slaves were buried underneath and they used to just be laid out. And there's several examples of that where there was black women brought to be slaves in the households here. So it was a practice not only was going on in the other part of the Atlantic, it was going on here. And if you think about how a number of them through the 18th century were used, child labour was used in the pits. That was a form of slavery, but of indenture. So it was always part of the 18th century culture here in Scotland. And the church, to its disgrace then and now, was very clear that this was part of the order of God, that those that were of colour were actually at a lower rank. So it wasn't something that Witherspoon wouldn't have been aware of, because it was part of Scottish society. But what I found fascinating about the talk was actually the links and the intertwining of Scottish life with his life there, and he's signing the Declaration. Partly just for a number of reasons, that the kind of the influences on the Declaration of Independence were very linked to the Enlightenment movement in Scotland in the 18th century, and that Enlightenment movement was one of the biggest recruitments to Freemasonry that existed the last 300 years. So a lot of the people who were intellectually stimulated through that became Freemasons. And I just think it's a fascinating story that kind of brings together strands. And for me, it brings strands that are even beyond that. So I just want to say thank you from my point of view for a very stimulating evening, Ronnie.
Thank you.
And it's going to sort lots of things running in my head that I've got to answer questions to as well. But I wonder what you think about you've described this network and this knitting together of the Freemasons, the Enlightenment, and the American Declaration of Independence, and I would throw even into that pot the 1320 Declaration of Arbroath. But it seems to be there was a kind of coming together of all sorts of strands, and that seems to be very amply described in what you've given tonight in terms of Witherspoon's life history. But I don't know if you share that view.
Yeah, the church, the Old Tennant Church, as I say, was the second church. The original one was built in the 1690s by Scots Covenanters who had fled Scotland and settled there. And they built the church and lived there, preached there, made a community there, very Presbyterian Scots type of thing, Protestant Presbyterian wise, and through disputes over the land, they moved from that church to where the church that I've shown you is now, and preached there and went on to worship there. But they were very, the old church is still there, the ruins of it are still there, and the graveyard is still there. And when I was there a few years ago, they were actively going through all the records and trying to number each grave with the person that was in it. And some of these graves went back to the late 1600s, you know. They were very, very staunch, very staunch, very anti-Catholic. And that was part of Witherspoon's makeup, you know. He saw, although he was in the college tutoring, but he saw what the British government were aiming at there is very much like the Covenanters had to suffer persecution here in Scotland. And that was why he decided to go for independence and revolution. You know? So, yeah, there is a lot in it, you know, whichever way you want to look at it, you know.
Alan Beck.
Ronnie, thanks very much. That was absolutely fascinating. The American Revolution is about the most interesting thing I think I've ever read about. I became really fascinated about it when I first went there, and I bought a book called Redcoats and Rebels. So I've known about John Witherspoon for a long time, but actually there's a plaque to him in Paisley Abbey, on the wall in Paisley Abbey. What Joe was saying there about the Enlightenment, I was quite taken by the fact that you have in your talk that he opposed the philosophical teachings of Francis Hutcheson. Francis Hutcheson was the great inspirer of the Scottish Enlightenment. I'm quite surprised that he spoke against the philosophy of Francis Hutcheson, especially then because the guy goes and basically, you know, is one of the people that starts the American Revolution. But the third thing I'll say is, as long as there's no Paisley councillors on this Zoom call, the statue outside the University of the West of Scotland is by Her Majesty's Sculptor and Ordinary in Scotland, Sandy Stoddart. Now, Sandy is the guy who Greenock Burns Club has commissioned to create a statue of Robert Burns in Greenock. And when I was talking to Sandy about raising money for this sort of thing, he actually went to Paisley, or to Renfrewshire Council in Paisley, and said, do you realise that this guy who's a founder of American Republic, etc., you know, has a great connection with Paisley. We would like you to put some money into a statue. And they absolutely refused and said there'd be no benefit whatsoever to Renfrewshire for having spent the money for this statue.
Yeah.
He then went to Princeton University and told them the story, and they said, fantastic idea, yeah, we'll give you $250,000. He then went back to Paisley and said, Princeton University are giving us $250,000, and you really don't think that this guy is worth a statue? So in the end, they put in money for a statue, and in fact, there are two of those statues. One is in University of West of Scotland, and the other one is in Princeton University. But if anyone asks, I didn't tell you that.
No.
Typical try to get a pound out of Paisley, man, wasn't it?
I did read that there was some college in America that had its name was linked to John Witherspoon, and there was a big movement to get the name changed. But whether that went through or not, I don't know. He certainly wasn't afraid to speak his mind if he didn't agree with the establishment or what anyone else said, if they opposed his views, you know. Or he certainly was of a mind to put his views across, you know, and he wouldn't be easily swayed one way or another.
Yeah, it's actually the Witherspoon Institute that we're trying to change the name of. It's a research centre.
Yeah. But the one with Francis Hutcheson, I did have something on it and read it, why he he didn't have high regard for Francis Hutcheson or his philosophical views on the Enlightenment, whatever it was. But what side Witherspoon was on as far as Enlightenment goes, I'm not sure, There's so many threads in it and so many different characters and views, and I suppose it's a bit of a lottery, a melting point as to how it eventually worked out, But here we saw a bit of a man like John Knox, as I see it, a bit of a Bible thumper. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and he wasn't afraid of anybody, which is proven. And I can't, as Joe was referring to, slavery was known about this side of the waters, but to actually be involved in it would be a different thing, I think, But
does anyone else got any questions? Or
can I ask Alan one? Alan Beck, being the musician that he is, have you ever seen a musical called 1776?
Never seen it, Bob, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's a musical, and this is actually what it's about. It was about the Declaration of Independence, and John Witherspoon in that he's actually portrayed in it.
Yeah.
In the musical, and there was a film that the play was in '69, and it was Broadway, and then it was made into a film 3 years later.
Sorry, Bob.
Yeah, I'm just saying there's clips on it on YouTube.
Yeah,
and John Witherspoon is portrayed in that.
Is he not portrayed in that stage thing, Hamilton?
It may well be. I've not seen Hamilton yet.
I haven't seen it, but that was it. But just to open up a wee bit further, I'm glad Dr. Ian McPhee's come in. He can take over this. Are you with us, Ian? Can you hear us?
I can hear you. You're doing perfectly yourself, Ronnie. Fascinating talk as usual. The one thing that fascinates me is the way that, as Joe mentioned, that you've managed to see all the connections between all of the contemporaries that were part of the emerging and Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And one of the names that you mentioned, who also is a signatory of the Declaration, is Benjamin Rush.
Well, can I come in on that? That's what I was going to ask you about. If you let me, I'll bring you in on it. The other character, apart from Richard Stockton, that was kicking about Paisley, as I'll put it, with John Witherspoon, is Benjamin Rush, who, as you know, as I've said, studied medicine and was made Surgeon General of the Continental Army by George Washington. Benjamin Rush is a fascinating character as well in his own right. Although he's not known to be a Freemason, he obviously moved about in Masonry circles. He actually married one of Richard Stockton's daughters. He got married to her. But while he was Surgeon General in the Revolutionary Army, he took odds with the then guy that was in charge, Surgeon General or whatever, and accused him of. He actually wrote a letter to Washington saying this guy's a charlatan. He's stealing goods, materials, and stuff that are destined for the soldiers and the wounded, profiteering from it. But that went to court, and Benjamin Rush was. He didn't win the case. In such case, he wrote a letter which he regretted in later years, decrying George Washington, saying that George Washington wasn't fit to hold the position he was in because of the stance that basically because he hadn't backed up Benjamin Rush against this guy that was later proved to be pilfering goods, etc., that were meant for the soldiers and the wounded. So nothing changes with politicians. But anyway, what I didn't know was the first time I did this presentation and mentioned Benjamin Rush, Dr. Ian came in and said that this guy was pretty famous in medical circles. And I'll pass it over to Ian. He probably knows more about it than I do. But Benjamin Rush was very, very famous in medical life. So over to you, Ian. Maybe you can.
I won't add too much because you've done brilliantly, and it's 2 minutes to 9. But when you when I heard
if you want,
when I heard the name Benjamin Rush, I just want to say this quickly. He is known as the father, or one of the founding fathers of modern American psychiatry, and he formulated one of the first disease concepts of alcoholism, and he did it with his contemporary in Britain called Thomas Trotter, who was a British naval surgeon who submitted his doctorate to Edinburgh University, and the two of them must have known each other because both of their theses on alcoholism, while not identical, do share the same first formulations of alcoholism, and I found that fascinating. Also, them being signatories of the Declaration of Independence and the new scientific modes and ways of thinking.
Yeah. Apparently, well, I think I alluded that he is anybody studying psychiatry or addiction or alcoholism or that sort of thing. Benjamin Rush is a must read, if you maybe put that in inverted commas, you know. So I find these characters really fascinating. Anyway, any more questions?
Yeah. Ronnie, I'm not saying the last question. You've probably answered about 10 of them that I was going to ask you anyway. But I read a bit that Witherspoon's name has been removed from Princeton Grammar School, I think it was, because of his links to Freemasonry, not to Freemasonry, to slavery.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I can't remember. There was something going on about, the movement and trying to be politically correct, taking his name off these things. But as I say, nearly all the signatories of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners, one way or another. So if they do it with Witherspoon, they're going to have to do it with a hell of a lot of other establishments and other organisations that were built up from these men, you know. So he's maybe been targeted, and well, not unfairly. There's no doubt that he was a slave owner, but we don't know. He wasn't a slave trader or dealt in slaves or anything like that. But as Joe alluded to, it was quite a common thing for the wealthy and privileged to have slaves.
Ronnie, if they were to remove the name of every slave owner in America, they'd have to get rid of the name of Washington DC, Washington State, and anything else that has Washington in front, because he only freed his 13 slaves in his will.
Mm-hmm.
So where does it stop?
Exactly. Yeah. The only thing, there's some allusion that he in his works he said Witherspoon, that we say slaves, he bought them, but they ran his ranch for him. It's not the kind of roots type thing, you know, whipping them and or that kind of thing, you know. I hope anyway that he did. I don't think he would be a brutal man towards these people, as were a lot of the other ones, you know. But one interesting fact is that during the war, both sides, both the George Washington and the Continental Army and the British government actively recruited slaves to fight for them. And the lure was that if they, I think it was 2 years, if they lasted 2 years, then they would automatically be emancipated and given freedom. That's another side of it. I don't know how many actually achieved it or whatever, but I know that's been alluded to in a couple of the films about the American War of Independence. But if they joined either force, they were promised emancipation after 2 years, as they survived 2 years.
But one of the facts of emancipation was definitely the fact that, very similar to actually when the Berlin Wall came down, when all the East Germans came over the wall into West Germany, they all turned round and went back because they couldn't afford anything. Mm-hmm. Now, after the American Civil War and the emancipation of the slaves, many of them actually travelled back south because they had nowhere to go in the north. They had no family, they had no money, they had no friends. At least back down in the south, they still had a roof over their heads, and that's why a lot of them travelled back down.
I think. Well, I don't know. I wasn't there. None of us were there. But it seems that maybe the emancipation, when it did come, I mean, it didn't come automatically. Different states lifted it at different times, different years. In fact, in the Caribbean, it wasn't well into the 1800s before it was slaves were emancipated. But maybe the brutality disappeared. But they hadn't. A lot of them hadn't been educated. They didn't know anything else. They didn't know. They were then left to their own devices, and they were exploited just as much. They were paid buttons, or they were paid anything at all, you know. So it's a fascinating subject, but I'm just glad I was never involved in it. And we can't really look at it through our eyes. You would need to look at it, put yourself in these men's positions, you know. Maybe Witherspoon saw these two guys and thought, right, if I buy them, I can give them an easy life, you know. Maybe he thought he was doing the right thing, the Christian thing in doing it, you know. As he did when he baptised John Montgomery or James Montgomery in Bees, you know, in 1700s, you know. And he did actively tutor coloured students at the college.
Ronnie, one of the other things too is that, you know, the black soldiers that fought for the North were only paid a quarter of the wage of a white soldier. And one of the other things that still went on in the Second World War, that the black soldiers in the Second World War were paid less than the Anglo-Saxons.
I didn't mean the presentation. I just thought at the end it was quite relevant to mention that I could have left it and portrayed him as being a squeaky clean guy, you know, and all the rest of it. Because it turns out maybe he wasn't, you know. But there again, was he? He just had different views from we did. It went along with the thing in the time. I mean, 18 months after his wife died, he married a 23-year-old. Widow, and then had another 2 kids, you know. So was that the done thing at the time? Was that an accepted thing? Was there other reasons to do it other than being
he was a Paisley man.
As
long as you don't change your name for Witherspoons and Paisley back to the last post.
There's a street in Paisley named after him, that's correct.
Yes, recently in the last 10 years, it's just been formed. Runs round the back of the High Street shopping mall.
Right.
There's a big park in it.
Right. That new area, right.
Aye.
Is that in about where the old church is, the bottom of New Street, and round about there?
Exactly, Ronnie. Bottom of when you go on New Street, you can turn and go right round. It brings you up to almost facing museum.
Yeah,
that's
where his church was. But I was more interested in what they actually did. I mean, like in Beath, you know, 1700s. What was Beath like in the 1700s? What was Paisley like in the 1700s? Beath, I know, had a really bad reputation in the 1700s for smuggling and being unlawful. In fact, the government garrisoned troops there in the late 1700s. That was after Witherspoon had left, and because of the smuggling, the worthies of Beath get fed up with customs and excise, so they got together and they went into Irvine and raided the customs house in Irvine and took back all the contraband and stuff that the customs men had taken for them in Beath. Took it back to Beath. It was a pretty lawless, unregulated place, was Beath. It was on the main route between Irvine and the coast and Paisley and Glasgow, and also Port Glasgow. So it was an ideal place to get rid of contraband or sell it, you know. A wee bit like the Wild West, but...
a wee bit like today.
we went today, but Witherspoon must have been aware of that as well, you know. So we can't look at things. We've got to try and put ourselves in their eyes and their perception, which is maybe you can maybe do that.
Right. I mean, that's what my attitude is, that you can't put our values back 200 years ago. It was of that time. A lot of the things they did, hanging children for stealing bread and all sorts of despicable things, the slavery, it was of that time. We would do it now, but we can't hope to think how these people worked at that time. It was just a different planet altogether.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I say, Ina, my wife, was quite talking about Elizabeth, John Witherspoon's wife. She said, and I hadn't really thought of that. There's never any mention of her, but she stuck by him through the whole thing. As I said earlier, Dolly Parton said, "Stick by your man," and bore him 10 children, and God knows, what else she went through living with him all that time. She must have been one hell of a woman, as my wife said. Just another side to it that we don't think about, or we don't realise, But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, lads. It was I found it.
Thank you.
It's a work in progress. Anyway, the more you go into these things, the more you find out about them, And I found the man quite interesting. The fact that I could walk the streets that he did and what he did, you think it's 1700s doing all that. Be a hell of a man to do that sort of thing today,
Thanks, Ronnie.
The main thing is stand up and speak your mind, That's not allowed now, So.
Well, if there's anybody want to stand up and speak their mind now, I'll let you go for it.
Thanks, anyway. Right.
Anyone else?
I'll bail out. Any other questions or queries? No.
Anyone else got any questions? No.
Right. I'll leave out. Well, thanks again, number 12, for inviting me, and
you're welcome.
I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll leave you to it.
Thank you very much, Ronnie.